Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to the Iron Park Podcast, and I am your host, Epsilon Persei 8. Epion. Anyway, as you could tell from the title of this podcast, we're going to do the third and final installment of the Universal Ostrich Farm saga. Sadly, from what you've probably seen, since this podcast is coming out much later after the decision, is that the Canadian Supreme Court decided not to hear the case before it, which resulted in, the Food Inspection Agency carrying out the cull. That is not the end result I wanted to see. I was hoping for a much more holistic approach to the situation. I was hoping the ostriches would survive. The reason being, it had been nearly a year since they were last infected. I was hoping they should just quarantine them, retest. If it came back, yeah, they're clean. They're not, infected anymore. They're not carrying a virus. Let them live. So on and so forth. That's not what happened. They just carried out with the stamp out policy, which is in accordance with Canadian law. They were able to do that. That it's legally grounded in law. A lot of people in agriculture and farming know this in terms of farm animals and stuff like that. When you lose 300 ostriches, I think that's almost $800,000 and $900,000 worth of livestock. It's a lot of money. It's an ungodly amount of money. The amount of resources and time that went into it, was it truly in the public interest? And a lot of people are saying no, it's not. One thing I don't really like that I'm seeing is retaliations. I've seen eggs and feces being thrown at government offices, and I understand the frustration and why that's happening, but I never agree with illegal or unlawful behavior. I just thought it's just something this podcast and something myself will never condone as illegal behavior. We have ways of legally changing things, so they take a lot of time, effort, and money, and it's much harder than, acts of violence or protests. And I feel like if people truly felt strongly about something, they would really push and continue to push, even after this is after this decision has already happened and the animals are, now terminated. You should still be writing your local MPs. You should still be writing, pushing for new legislation, for new rules and guidelines, for changes to laws, and also going to the ballot boxes and voting for people who have that kind of stuff in their platform that supports your point of view and the way you want agriculture and farming to be conducted in the country of Canada. That's where change happens. That's how it's done. And that's how it's done legally and lawfully. So even though the outcome of the Universal Ostrich Farm was not ideal, obviously violence doesn't solve anything. Illegal behavior doesn't solve anything. It'll just get people not to want to be on your side or side with you. They'll have no compassion or sympathy towards what happened because, people just don't agree with criminal responses or that sort of behavior. They just don't. They just go well, I don't like smelling shit when I walk by the downtown. So, and who did that? Oh, those ostrich people. Okay, well now I don't like them just because of that. And that's what I mean. You have to take the high ground. You just have to. It's just the way it is. We live in a fair and democratic society. These are the terms of service, basically, is that you have to abide by the rules. And if you don't like something, there's ways to change it, but it does take a lot of time, effort, and money. It's sad. It's a sad outcome. I hope people continue to sort of push for legislative changes, not through a legal means, but through perfectly legal means. That I think then maybe people can get behind and, sort of support more, either through GoFundMe's or whatever. People hate the illegal stuff, or at least I do. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say like why they decided to go that way. Was it just like a point, proving a point, a show of force? Was it just because we could? Was it just because this is the way it always has been? At the very least, it's sort of shined a light on sort of like the more archaic sort of laws and policy that Canada has in some of its legislation that should be reviewed and challenged and, looked at more closely. And it speaks a lot to like people's rights and stuff like that. But I seen an article where I think the ostrich farm was being reimbursed for the damages or like for the culling, which you could even say like that's not a proper use of that funds, or that's not a proper use of like, we could have avoided having to pay out the ostrich farm for the losses of their ostriches. Like there's many things like that kind of come up out of that. So do we need to hire like all those people to go there and create this big thing and, secure the location? Did we need to then pay out all this money, or would it have been cheaper to just retest the ostriches and then be like, oh, what do you know? They're healthy. We don't have to execute them or pay out for the execution. Like the agricultural reimbursement or whatever. It's an interesting thing. It's definitely a topic worth debating. I hope like maybe some lawmakers or, some politicians are looking at it more closely and saying like, hey, this is maybe something we can get behind. The thing is, it does seem a little politically homeless, and a lot of politicians were very quiet on it. And I think the reason being is you do have a lot of agricultural farmers, like chicken farmers and stuff like that, who don't want any disease or potential risk or hazard of disease being like stamp out policy, get rid of all those ostriches. So, and a lot of like chicken farmers are typically conservative. So you have these conservative politicians that are kind of like I do have constituents that are in favor of the stamp out policy, and then I also have some constituents that aren't. And this is like the weird thing about a lot of politicians is that they remain politically homeless until the topic is favorable to them, or they have stats and data to show, okay, it's safe now to get behind this. Very few politicians get out in front of a topic beforehand when it's not safe, because a lot of them just don't have like a good sense of like where the ground is, or what's ethically or morally correct, or what's the most logical and rational approach to things. And I feel like, that's kind of why I think it didn't really get like a big solid political backing. It ended up politically homeless. It didn't become a political football, and it sort of wasn't able to be leveraged one way or the other. Then there was like the Freedom Convoy pseudo association, that kind of like weird. I don't even know if it was real or not, but it was like kind of thrown about in the media. And then that sort of like lumped them in as like conservative, or like, you know what I mean? And that was like a weird thing too, or like some people say like far right conservative, and it just gets extremely muffled, where people are just like, we don't even know how to approach something like this. And it's good that it remain, like I said in the previous podcast, I'm like, this is something that should remain politically homeless. It might be to its benefit, because then it might be safer for like someone else to come in and be like, okay, like it's not a right wing thing. And then a left wing politician could intervene and be like, no, we're going to do, what's reasonable and rational here and resolve the situation amicably. And it just doesn't happen to be the case. They just sort of let the law as it is at that time sort of proceed. And it's unfortunate. It's not the outcome I wanted to see. Like I was hoping like they'd do more tests, or they'd agree to export them or something to like Texas and let them live there, or Florida, or whoever it was that reached out and said they could live on a ranch there. Like it was that was the outcome I wanted, but it was not the outcome we received. So that's the end of it for now. We'll see if like any future changes or politicians sort of decide to introduce new legislation or anything like that. Maybe Alberta will pick up notes from it, even though it didn't happen in Alberta. Maybe the Alberta politicians are looking at BC and being like, could we make those changes here? before, it does happen here. Food for thought. It's interesting. Maybe. Yeah, that's pretty much the episode. I don't really know what else much to comment on or say. There's not a whole lot to really say. This is the society we live in. Canadians get what they vote for. If you want to invoke change, get involved politically. Join a certain party, make your opinion or voices heard, put it as like put it forth as like a motion or like as a letter or like an opinion piece or something. Get like maybe some members within that party to help, sort of get behind it. Maybe they won't, and you got to kind of shop around for what political party can really spearhead it. And it's just something as simple as maybe you start as a mayor, run for mayor. Lots of people run for mayors. I don't know, like a strongly worded letter, and you can get other people behind it. If you can sort of convince everyone to be like, hey, if you really want to see change, can you please just write a letter to this MP? And like, you got to do it like periodically and regularly, not just when the topic is hot. Like right now, there's probably perhaps a lot of letters pouring in, but this isn't going to do them any good or any well if, 6 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years down the road, no more letters trickle in, maybe 1, 2. If it remains a persistent and consistent, and maybe there's other circumstances and other like matters that happen with other farmers and their livestock and they feel similar, you can kind of keep it going like that and keep pushing it forward. But that's the problem, right? It's like time heals all wounds, and then you sort of let things go, and you let what you knew or what you felt was right sort of dissipate with time, because what's happened to you is now done and over with, but it may still impact other people. So if you truly cared about the change, you would persist and follow through with a very time-consuming, long and arduous, and very costly way of going about affecting real change in the world legally. So I don't know. That's kind of like my send-off message. I don't really know what else to talk about. I wanted to I knew there wouldn't be a whole lot to say in this podcast regarding the ostrich farm, because the conclusion was kind of conclusive. I mean, I know you're looking for my opinion. It is what it is. It's a disagreement on it's just a disagreement. It's two perspectives, right? It's like, one's like the stamp out policy. It's existed for a long time, and why it exists is to protect like other flocks and stuff like that. But then it kind of, the nuance of it is like, well, are they still infected? And it's gone on so long now that it doesn't make reasonable sense to still stamp them out. And a part of it might be to be like, so for other people who want to resist this policy, or for other people who do it, don't think that it'll protect your flock or your farm animals, because even 9 months or a year down the road after the stamp out order comes down, it's going to follow through and happen no matter what. So it's not like leveraging the legal system or leveraging legal challenges is going to, work for you. That might be the thought process behind it. And I'm not saying that's what the thought process was, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's just weird, right? Because you do have other farmers and ranchers and stuff out there that feel a certain way about it. They obviously don't want these bison and buffalo or whatever coming around their cattle, or what's it called, like tuberculosis or whatever. And then people would want the stamp out policy 100% on those, because they, it would financially ruin them, even though there is ways to be reimbursed. The government at scale probably couldn't afford to reimburse all the cattle farmers across the country, right? So that's what it becomes. It's one of those weird things. It's a weird thing. I'm an animal lover. Obviously, I want the animals to live if that was a possibility or option. But you're at odds with a lot of people with a stake in agriculture, seeing it as like a point of principle and a point of interest to be like, no, they have to be put away. And I think when you're against something like that, a lot of the time those big players aren't going to be vocal either. They're going to be very silent with the pressure they apply. Even if it's just sort of like giving their opinion or 2 cents to the people in charge. And I'm not saying this happened, but it's potentially what happened, right? So it's a balance of like keeping different groups happy. And there's a lot of people that kind of remain silent on it because they're just kind of like, they saw both perspectives and they're kind of like, oh fuck, I don't know. They're like, I wish they would live. Like, I wish they could, if they're fine, but if they're, but then if everyone's at scale starts like delays the stamp out policy through like legal leveraging. But, in this instance, I don't think it spread anywhere and nothing bad happened. So like everything's good. But let's say that becomes like a trend in the future and people constantly delay stamp out policy through legal measures. And what if that leads to like a widespread, tuberculosis or whatever disease it is. And then then you have like this big, like, there's no beef that year or no beef exports that year because it wiped it all out. Like that's at scale, like the most largest and ridiculous means. But I think that's like the ultimate fear, right? Is that you don't produce anything. No, you don't produce anything. And so they kind of want it to be like, we don't want to see that happen where all of a sudden it becomes like an acceptable norm or whatever to think like, oh, it just resisted in court and then, you'll be able to keep your animals. Which it seems archaic. It seems diabolic. And if you have that opinion, I'm not saying that's wrong. To some extent, it probably is correct, right? It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. And then, I don't know, and then the deeper issue that it kind of speaks to is sort of like ranching and agriculture. And then you have, people that are even further against, that they support veganism 100%. We shouldn't even be raising animals for food and agriculture, and they shouldn't be looked at as property. It gets it very philosophical very quickly. And it gets into like this weird area. It gets into like this. It's a very human problem. It's a very mucky human problem. Yeah, like it's not something good. Like I even feel gross like talking about it and kind of giving the benefit of the doubt or like sort of like this like sugar coating or like, I guess like it's kind of like this softer touch to like this thing that's like very harmful or like hurtful, I should say. Very hurtful. I don't know what to say. Like it feels wrong that they died and they were more than likely not transmitting the virus and they were healthy birds. It feels like there should be maybe, if I was to offer a solution to this, there should be maybe parameters put into agriculture, especially if they're like like food producing agriculture, like it's just like a hobby farm or whatever, to have like a quarantine area or like infrastructure so that preservation of that animal or animals or that herd could exist long term, and then implement retesting. Yeah, that's probably what would be best, right? But then at scale, it is expensive, right? Like how do you, like let's say you have a very large herd and then keeping them captive inside a building completely isolated from the rest of the world. Like this, then does that then infringe on animal cruelty because they're being confined into like a small area? And then like how big of an area do you need? And like an indoor area, like it just, it's a problem that grows at scale. It gets very, very, very messy. I guess the long and the short of it's life is full of tragedy and sad things, and we try to navigate them the best we can, but for some things it just seems like they're outside of our means to deal with accordingly or properly or in the most holistic ways possible. And it always boils down to the same thing. It's a money issue. I've learned something from this. I've learned a lot about like the laws regarding agriculture and farm animals, and sort of like the necessary steps that I should probably take if I want to make sure my animals don't get infected or sick, about, veterinarian, care, quarantining care. So if I was to ever have a farm, I'd be like, okay, well, like what should I be prepared for if the worst case scenario happens, and how could I isolate these animals and quarantine these animals? Would I need a property large enough to do that, and what would be considered not cruel? Like, I think that's like a big learning point for me, and maybe other people that kind of watch this fall out. It's interesting. Yeah, it was sad. Anyway, folks, I hope the next podcast is going to be better, but I'm seeing it's probably going to be a little bit better, but it's still kind of like an early news thing that's going around. But anyway, folks, until next time, stay classy, San Diego, or Canada, British Columbia, Alberta. Cheerio.